Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to start International Symposium for Peace 2020, The Road to Nuclear Abolition, Steps Ahead in Global Danger. International Symposium for Peace, The Road to Nuclear Abolition has been held since 1995 to share the voices of A-bombed cities appealing for the nuclear abolition, and this is the 26th time. In order to prevent the spread of coronavirus, we are not inviting the general audience, and the speakers from abroad are with us online. But it's a great pleasure to have this symposium in Nagasaki, which marks the 75th anniversary of bombing. The symposium is organized by Nagasaki City, Nagasaki Foundation for the Promotion of Peace, Asahi Shimbun, and supported by Hiroshima City, Hiroshima Peace Culture Foundation, Nagasaki Prefecture, Hiroshima Prefecture, Nagasaki Culture Casting Corporation, and Hiroshima Home TV. I will be serving as MC. I am Nao Fujisaka from NCC. I would like to ask for your kind support. And today's symposium is being streamed live using YouTube channel. In the first part of this symposium, we have simultaneous interpretation between Japanese and English. As for the receivers for the Japanese audience, channel 1 is for Japanese and channel 2 is for English. As for the program and the profiles of the speakers, please refer to the program.
Before the opening, Mr. Tomihisa Taue, the mayor of Nagasaki City, will greet you. Good morning, everyone. I wish to extend a few words of greeting for the International Symposium for Peace 2020. Thank you very much for coming. This year marks 75th anniversary since the A-bombing. We are now in the summer, which marks the 75th anniversary, and to this important time, we have prepared various events to look at the 75 years of the A-bombing. However, all of these, or many of these events and symposiums have been cancelled due to the spread of COVID-19. However, I am very pleased to see this symposium happening today, and this is now accessed by many people online. And this symposium is organized every 2 years in Nagasaki. I'd like to say thank you all the people who have made this possible, especially Asahi Shimbun and others. And also like to say thank you to you all for coming. So this has been 75 years, and many events have been cancelled. But this time, we have invited Dr. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. And Dr. Perry was planning to come to Nagasaki. I was looking forward to seeing him. However, because of the coronavirus, he was not able to come, but he still joined us online. Of course, coronavirus brought us many challenges and difficulties, but this is also an opportunity for us to take a new of challenges, to try out new things, or maybe this could be an opportunity for us to create a stronger society, uniting people together. The situation surrounding nuclear weapons will be discussed in part 1 and part 2 in this symposium. And looking at the situation, of the nuclear weapons, there are a lot of negative things taking place. But now we have 40 countries which ratify the Ban Treaty of the nuclear weapons. And not only the superpowers of big countries, but small countries, they join together hand in hand to create this treaty. This is such a big achievement. And also, we have invited the director of RECONA of Nagasaki University, and we see many younger people who are joining in this activity against nuclear weapons. So I see a lot of hope in our activity. And Saro Setsuko said at the time of the Nobel Peace Award, don't give up. We must grow to a hope that we see. So we have to be all reminded, and we have to find hope, and we have to grow towards that hope. We once again must strengthen our strength to grow towards the hope. So once again, those who have come today, and also those who have made this possible, and also those who are joining remotely, I'd like to say thank you, and also to our panelists and speakers, I'd like to thank them all for their contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the Mayor Taue of Nagasaki City. Next, on behalf of supporting organization, Mayor of Hiroshima City, Mr. Kazumi Matsui, sent us a message, and please allow me to read the message. I would like to send my message to congratulate the opening of the International Symposium for Peace 2020, The Road to Nuclear Weapons Abolition, on August 6, 1945 in Hiroshima. The first atomic bombing in human history ruined the city in an instant, took away a great number of precious lives, and traumatized those who survived. Despite grave physical and psychological damages, hibakusha have told their stories and appealed for peace with a determination that their sufferings should never be repeated. However, the world still holds more than 13,000 nuclear weapons, and the nuclear disarmament is at a standstill. While global solidarity is imperative to fight against the new threat of the coronavirus pandemic, we see self-centered nationalism in ascendance, tensions heightened by international exclusivity and rivalry. I want our current leaders to remember their courageous predecessors. When nuclear superpowers, the US and USSR, were engaged in a tense, escalating nuclear arms race, their leaders manifested reason and turned to dialogue to seek disarmament. We want leaders around the world to pursue negotiation in good faith on nuclear disarmament as mandated by Article 6 of the NPT, and respond to the yearning of the civil society for entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is a milestone on the road to a nuclear weapon-free world. To achieve a peaceful, sustainable world, each one of us must confront our current circumstances, transcend differences of status and opinion, and strive together in a spirit of tolerance toward our ideal. To accomplish this, we must never dismiss the atomic bombings and the war as mere events of the past. It is vital that we internalize the voices of hibakusha and the efforts of those aiming at a peaceful world, then drive steadily forward. World leaders must move forward with us, advancing civil society's ideal. Therefore, it is of great importance to increase support for Hibakusha's appeals among civic societies and to establish global common values which believes that the nuclear-free world is the first step toward perpetual world peace. It is really significant that this International Peace Symposium is held in this A-bombed city as a forum to share and strengthen the appeals of nuclear weapons abolition. I should like to express my profound respect to your efforts in organizing this symposium. Hiroshima City, along with the nearly 7,900 member cities of Mayors for Peace, is committed to our pledge to create an environment supportive of leaders taking action for nuclear abolition. I sincerely expect you to stay united with us and take actions toward the total elimination of nuclear weapons, which is absolute evil, and beyond that, a world of genuine lasting peace. I should conclude wishing a great success of the International Peace Symposium 2020 and continued good health and happiness for all of you. August 1st, 2020, Kazumi Matsui, Mayor of the City of Hiroshima. So this was a message from Mayor Matsui of Hiroshima City. Today, on behalf of Hiroshima, Mr. Takashi Koizumi, Chair of Hiroshima Peace Culture Foundation, is with us.
And let's move on to the opening. First, we will play a video in which Mr. Mikhail Gorbachev, former president of the Soviet Union, is speaking for this symposium. Mr. Gorbachev dubbed as Gobi in Japan, realized nuclear arms reduction during the Cold War and brought an end to it. He came to Nagasaki and offered flowers to the Peace Memorial in April 1991, making him the first to do so among the leaders of nuclear superpowers.
Уважаемые участники симпозиума, уважаемый мэр, уважаемые представители газеты «Асахи», дорогие коллеги и друзья, я рад сегодня приветствовать всех вас, принимающих участие в симпозиуме «За мир без ядерного оружия». Символично, что эта встреча проходит в городе Нагасаки, который, как и Хиросима, 75 лет назад подвергся атомной бомбардировке, оставившей десятки тысяч погибших и покалеченных людей, выжженную землю. Мне приходилось быть в этом городе. И это в память все остается навсегда. К сожалению, мы не можем все вместе встретиться здесь сегодня по известной причине. Массовое заражение и гибель сотен тысяч людей от пандемии – новый вызов, угрожающий современной цивилизации. Он обостряет прежние нерешенные проблемы. Человечеству необходимо совместно выработать комплексный всеобъемлющий ответ, выйти на новый уровень международного сотрудничества для создания более надежной системы международной безопасности. И тема ядерного оружия должна находиться в центре внимания. По-моему, это понятно для всех. Я приветствую участие в симпозиуме Уильяма Перри, который чуть больше года назад совместно с Джорджем Шульцем и Сэмом Наном опубликовали в газете Wall Street Journal статью, который начинается с сурового предупреждения. Соединенные Штаты Америки, их союзников и Россию поразил опасный политический паралич, который будто по ошибке или недосмотру может привести к военной конфронтации и даже к применению ядерного оружия впервые за время его существования. Налицо непосредственно угроза ядерного противостояния, еще более опасного, дезориентирующего и экономически затратного, чем холодная война. Я разделяю тревогу авторов статьи, поддерживаю их предложения, поскольку сам неоднократно предлагал сделать именно это, возобновить стратегическое взаимодействие между Соединенными Штатами и Россией, выделить во всем комплексе российско-американской повестки дня как главный приоритет вопросы предотвращения новой гонки вооружений и дальнейшего дальнейшего сокращения ядерного оружия, а также обеспечения стратегической стабильности. Подтвердить заявление, сделанное мною и президентом Рональдом Рейганом в 1985 году. В ядерной войне не может быть победителя. Она никогда не должна быть развязана. Считаю, что в российско-американском диалоге необходимо рассмотреть не только конкретные вопросы, например, проблему ракет средней дальности, которая обострилась после выхода Соединенных Штатов Америки из договора СНВ и продления договора СНВ-3, но и принципиальные вопросы мира и безопасности, прежде всего необходимость возобновить движение мира к безъядерному оружию, к миру без ядерного оружия. В этой связи можно только приветствовать обращение ведущих американских ученых, среди которых 10 лауреатов Нобелевской премии, и к президенту Трампу с просьбой не возобновлять испытания ядерного оружия. Я приветствую госпожу Рэйчел Бронсон, возглавляющую бюллетень ученых-атомщиков. К сожалению, стрелка на ваших часах судного дня вновь приблизилась к критической отметке. А ведь совсем недавно, благодаря усилиям прежде всего СССР и США, удалось отвести угрозу ядерного апокалипсиса, прекратить холодную войну, выйти на сотрудничество по многим важнейшим проблемам, стоящим перед человечеством. Я надеюсь, что вы будете продолжать вашу чрезвычайно важную деятельность по информированию и предупреждению человечества о грозящей катастрофе. Дорогие друзья, мы, представители гражданского общества, должны возглавить и вновь развернуть всемирную кампанию против гонки вооружений, ядерных вооружений, за сокращение ядерных арсеналов и в конечном счете за полную ликвидацию ядерного оружия.
There was a video message by Mr. Mikhail Gorbachev, former president of the Soviet Union. So let's move on to part 1. 100 seconds to midnight. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which celebrates 75th anniversary this year, advanced Doomsday clock, an indicator of the catastrophe of nuclear war, by 20 seconds. And this is the closest ever to midnight. Their decision is based on U.S. withdrawal from Iran nuclear deal, deadlock of denuclearization negotiation with North Korea, expiry of the INF treaty between U.S. and Russia, and others, all of which worsen the situation surrounding nuclear issues. Also, a review conference of the NPT, which marks 50th anniversary, was postponed due to the spread of the COVID-19. So what can be done to prevent new risks of new nuclear age? And what is the way forward that Japan should take as one and only A-bound country? So we will discuss all of these issues connecting Nagasaki, the last A-bound city, with the United States online. Today, Dr. William Perry, Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration, who put forward editorials titled World Without Nuclear Weapons in 2007, will deliver a keynote lecture remotely from his home in California. He is one of the first men who had great influence over the policy of President Obama, a Nobel Peace Laureate, and Dr. Perry has published a new book, The Bulletin, last month in Japan and the US. Dr. Perry, please start your talk.
Let me begin by saying, welcome, how sorry I am I'm not able to be with you in presence. I had planned to be there in person for this conference, but of course that was prevented by the pandemic. I want to warmly welcome all my Japanese friends. I have a special greeting for the Japanese survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You are the conscience of the world. And finally, I want to say what an honor it is to be on the same program with Mikhail Gorbachev, who has done so much in his career for world peace. It is 100 seconds to midnight. That certainly sounds ominous. But what does it mean? The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists each year estimates the relative danger of nuclear catastrophe and quantifies that by setting the hands at the Doomsday clock. They've been doing this since 1947, and this year they set the clock the closest to Doomsday it has ever been. That is, they are saying that the danger of a nuclear catastrophe today is as great as it was during the darkest days of the Cold War. And yet most Americans, most Russians, most Europeans, and most Japanese do not understand this. Most people think that the danger of a nuclear war ended with the ending of the Cold War. As a result, the nuclear policies of the United States and Russia do not reflect the perilous position we are in. And the danger increases as other countries seek to enter the nuclear club. North Korea already has a nuclear arsenal, and Iran is threatening to get one. But is it likely that any nuclear power will actually use the bomb? Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no country has ever done so. Deterrence seems to work. So why do the scientists who set the Doomsday clock think the danger is so great? And what can we do to lower that danger? My talk seeks to answer those two questions. But first, some relevant history. During the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviet Union was building up its nuclear forces so that it would be able to launch a surprise disarming attack on the United States. That belief drove our nuclear force structure and our policies. At the same time, the Russians believed that we were building up our nuclear forces for a surprise attack on them. Those dynamics drove an arms race that in time resulted in each country having a nuclear arsenal of over 30,000 nuclear weapons, far in excess of what was needed for deterrence. This armed race entailed huge costs and great dangers, but both nations believed that it was necessary for their survival. Well, the Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the decade of the 90s, each side began a nuclear dismantlement program that took its arsenal down from 30,000 weapons each to about 5,000 each, along with an end to hostile relations. During this period, I was the Secretary of Defense, and I worked closely with my Russian counterpart, almost as if we were allies. We oversaw major reductions in each country's nuclear arsenals. Together, we dismantled 8,000 nuclear weapons during the 3 years that I was Secretary of Defense. I thought this big dismantlement program would continue because we still had many more weapons than we needed for deterrence, and because we had developed such good relations with Russia. Our relations were so good then that Russia agreed to embed one of their top brigades in an American division for the peace enforcement operation in Bosnia. And during this period of goodwill and cooperation, we never gave up our policies and implicit belief that the primary threat to the United States was a surprise nuclear attack from Russia. And with the return of hostilities early in the next century, that belief went from implicit to explicit. And during this past decade, that hostility has become so intense that we have started what can fairly be called Cold War II. I thought one Cold War was enough, but we are now prepared to start a second one. Now, just as in the Cold War, we keep our nuclear weapons on high readiness so they can be launched in a few minutes if we get an alert that a Russian attack is underway. This practice is called launch on warning, and the Russians do the same. This is incredibly dangerous. In fact, the greatest nuclear danger today, as I will explain, is that the quick launch posture of the United States and Russia could lead to an accidental nuclear war. How could this happen? How could this happen? If the president makes a launch decision, since we believe that our greatest threat is a surprise disarming attack from Russia, we have postured our nuclear forces today, just as in the Cold War, so that they can be launched within a few minutes of a launch order from the president. And we have developed a surveillance system that can detect a Russian launch within a few minutes after its liftoff, and a communication system that can transmit such detections to our command center, where it is analyzed and evaluated. If the command center concludes it is a valid launch, it communicates this to the president. He will have perhaps 5 or 10 minutes to decide whether to launch our long-range missiles before they are destroyed in their silos. This is a truly amazing technical system, and it works very well, nearly all the time. In fact, it has only led to false alarms a handful of times. The problem, however, is that it only takes only one false alarm to start a nuclear war by accident. If the president makes a launch decision, our missiles will be on the way in a few minutes, and he cannot call them back or destroy them in flight if he later determines that it was a false alarm. That is, he will have started a nuclear war by accident. In the false alarms we have experienced to date, we have always caught the false alarm before the president made a launch decision. But on one occasion during the Cold War, it nearly led to a disaster. At that time, I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And on the night of the false alarm, I was awoken by a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. The voice on the other end of the line identified himself as the watch officer of the North American Air Defense Command. He got right to the point and told me that their computers were showing 200 missiles on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. For one horrible moment, I thought that the Armageddon that we had narrowly escaped in the Cuban Missile Crisis was about to take place. Happily, he quickly added that he had determined that it was a false alarm, and he was calling me to see if I could help him figure out what had gone wrong with their computers. Before he had determined it was a false alarm, he had called the White House to alert the president. The president's national security advisor took the call and believed that an attack really was underway. He was about to awaken the president to tell him that he had about 5 minutes to decide whether to launch our ground-made missiles before they were destroyed in their silos. But before he did, he got a follow-up call telling him that it was, in fact, a false alarm. The White House had then called me for assistance. That night, I was not able to determine what had malfunctioned. It took several days to locate a faulty chip in one of the computers. It was a simple equipment malfunction, easily fixed, but potentially catastrophic. A false alarm that occurred a year earlier was a result of an error by a computer operator who thought he was installing the operating tape for the computer, but instead put in a training tape simulating an attack. These examples starkly illustrate the danger of starting a nuclear war accidentally because of computer error or human error. To date, these errors have always been caught before it was too late, but humans do err and machines do err, and they will continue to. And there's additional danger of starting a nuclear war by making a political miscalculation. The most striking historical example of that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. In that crisis, both Kennedy and Khrushchev were doing everything they could to avoid a nuclear war. But both of them had military advisors telling them to take military action, and both of them were acting on information that was often quite wrong. After the crisis, Kennedy said that he thought the chance of the crisis erupting into a nuclear war were about 1 in 3, one chance in 3 for ending his civilization. But then he said he was not aware that the Soviets, besides having the medium-range missiles that were not yet operational, also had in Cuba short-range missiles that were operational and already mated with nuclear warheads. If Kennedy had ordered military action against Cuba, as the Joint Chiefs of Staff were recommending, our troops would have been decimated on the beachhead by tactical nuclear weapons, and a general nuclear war would surely have followed. It was sound judgment that led Kennedy to ignore the advice of his military advisors and continue to work for a diplomatic solution. But it is clear that we avoided a nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis more by good luck than by good judgment. Sadly, the hostile relations between the United States and Russia today create the breeding grounds for another political miscalculation. It's not clear where and how that might occur: in the Baltics, in Ukraine, or on the borders of Russia, where we regularly conduct patrols with both reconnaissance aircraft and ships. My conclusion is that today we still face the danger of a nuclear conflict, but the danger is not a planned attack from Russia. Even if they had the motivation to do so, which I do not believe, they know that an attack that destroyed our country would result in a counterattack that would destroy their country. The Russians are not suicidal. They're not stupid. So deterrence works. The real danger of a nuclear catastrophe is not from a planned attack from Russia, which is what a defense strategy implicitly assumes. Our real danger is from an accident, such as responding to a false alarm or to a political miscalculation. Neither is likely, but both have happened. And when they did, we avoided a nuclear catastrophe by intelligent people making intelligent decisions, but also by good luck. The survival of our civilization should not depend on our continuing to have good luck. This month, we look back in sadness at the deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we vow that nuclear weapons will never be used again. For if they were, the resulting tragedy would be far greater than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Each of those cities was destroyed by one nuclear bomb with a destructive power of about 15 kilotons. Most of the thermonuclear bombs in the military forces of the United States and in Russia have a destructive power 10 times greater. Many of them have a destructive power 100 times greater. Indeed, both the United States and Russia have tested thermonuclear bombs whose destructive power was 1,000 times greater than the Hiroshima bomb. And each of our countries has about 4,000 thermonuclear weapons in its nuclear arsenal, of which 1,550 are deployed. The tragedy that occurred 75 years ago led to the destruction of 2 cities and about 200,000 deaths. A nuclear war today could result in hundreds of cities being destroyed and many tens of millions dead. Even discounting the worldwide environmental disaster could very well lead to the end of our civilization. A nuclear war could even be an extinction event, comparable to when the asteroid struck the Earth 66 million years ago, which led to the extinction of all dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were the victims of a natural catastrophe, but now we have the power to bring about our own destruction. In sum, I believe that our nuclear weapons pose an existential threat to mankind, and the only lasting solution to this deadly problem is to abolish nuclear weapons. Many people have pursued this objective, but have encountered huge practical and political problems. The first really dramatic move in that direction came in 1986, when President Reagan and President Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, where they discussed both countries giving up all of their nuclear weapons. They came close to an agreement to abolish nuclear weapons, but got hung up on a disagreement about what to do with ballistic missile defense systems. Had they been able to agree, it is not clear that they could have made the decision stick in their own countries, considering the firestorm they caused by even discussing it. But there were at least 3 positive outcomes in that meeting. The landmark INF Treaty, now sadly abandoned by the US and Russia. The memorable phrase, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought." And most importantly, making the idea of abolishing nuclear weapons thinkable. It's now thinkable. 2 days after Reykjavik, George Shultz, who had been with Reagan at Reykjavik, 2 decades after Reykjavik, George Shultz, who had been with Reagan at Reykjavik in his capacity of Secretary of State, was still thinking about it. He decided to revisit that meeting. What resulted from that reconsideration was a series of editorials in the Wall Street Journal. George asked me, as well as Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn, to join him in co-authoring those editorials. In these articles, we described the dangers of nuclear weapons and called for their abolition. The response to them was surprisingly strong, leading to many invitations to speak about why he would come to believe in nuclear abolition after long careers in supporting robust nuclear forces for the United States. For the next few years, we traveled around worldwide as apostles of nuclear abolition. We believed that the necessary political actions could be taken if the general public came to understand that the nuclear dangers we face today were equivalent to what they had faced during the Cold War. To that end, we produced a video, The Nuclear Tipping Point, and organized many showings of that video for the public, where we would engage an audience in dialogue about nuclear issues. Most of the questions had to do with what the public could do to help advance the abolition of nuclear weapons. And for a few years, we seemed to be making good progress. We were invited to meet with the heads of state of Russia, Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom. We were particularly encouraged by President Obama's reaction. Only a month after he took office in 2009, he traveled to Prague to make his remarkable speech. I speak clearly and with conviction the commitment of the United States to seek the peace of the world without nuclear weapons. I was thrilled when I heard his speech and was convinced that we were going to be successful. He invited us to the Oval Office, where the discussion had to do with how to implement the promise of his speech. After our meeting, he invited us to the White House Theater, where he showed our video, Nuclear Tipping Point, to his nuclear security team. And he introduced the video by telling his team that the video represented his thinking on the subject of nuclear abolition, and he hoped it would represent theirs as well. I will never forget the thrill I felt as I believed we were in fact going to succeed on our mission impossible. The next month, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California, sponsored a showing of our video in Hollywood. He invited the four of us and our spouses to be his guests of honor, walking with him on the red carpet that led to the theater. The whole event was organized just like a Hollywood premiere, including the champagne reception that followed. That red carpet premiere was special, but a few months later, the most important event occurred. President Obama succeeded in reaching an agreement with Russia for an arms control treaty, New START, for the reduction of nuclear weapons in Russia and in the United States. New START set up an elaborate protocol for maintaining the agreement, including strict verification procedures. The watchword was trust but verify, and a continuing dialogue on nuclear issues. The actual reductions, I thought, were relatively modest, about 10%, to 1,550 deployed nuclear weapons. But both sides agreed and intended to follow New START with a follow-on agreement with much more substantial reductions. Without doubt, the day of the signing of the New START was a high point of our crusade to abolish nuclear weapons. But from that day on, it went precipitously downhill. The first sign of trouble came in the committee hearings on the ratification of New START. Since the treaty called for equivalent and modest reductions, and since it had extensive procedures for verification, I had assumed the treaty ratification would be a sure thing. I was wrong. The ratification debate quickly turned ugly in a way that had little to do with the merits of the treaty. In hindsight, I can see that the treaty got caught up in the politics of the day, namely the growing dislike, even the hatred of President Obama by some of the senators. As a result, the treaty, which dealt with a nonpartisan issue, became a victim of partisan politics. President Obama was not able to get ratification during the regular term of the Senate that year. After the Senate term closed in October, he conducted intensive closed-door negotiations with opponents of the treaty. The result of those discussions was his agreement to support the defense spending bill favored by the treaty opponents, which included a large program of nuclear modernization, and it included their agreement to then let the treaty be ratified. Following that agreement, the treaty was ratified in the lame duck session in November, but at a price that I believe was too high. Another implicit consequence of the fight was to get the treaty ratified was President Obama's apparent conclusion that the price he paid for ratification and the heavy drain on his time it entailed precluded his continuing forward with his goal of major reductions in nuclear weapons. Probably contributing to that conclusion was the replacement of Medvedev with Putin as president of Russia. Obama had a very positive relationship with Medvedev, but an acrimonious relationship with Putin. In politics, personal relationships do matter. But as long as he was in office, Obama did continue a program that did not require congressional approval, a program to improve the security of fissile material worldwide. This important program made us all safer by making it much harder for a terror group to get a nuclear bomb. The sequel to the agreement that Obama made to get New START ratified was that the nuclear modernization program not only survived, it grew. We are now programmed to rebuild our nuclear arsenal over the next few decades with entirely new weapons to replace all of our present ones at a cost of over $1 trillion, and a danger that cannot be quantified, but is certainly great. Russia, of course, has an equivalent program, which President Putin described in his State of the Federation speech this year as one of his major achievements. So it seemed that my impossible dream really wasn't possible, at least at this time. I decided to put on the shelf my crusade to abolish nuclear weapons. I still believe that we should abolish nuclear weapons, but I do not see any viable path to achieve that goal in my lifetime. But I am not giving up. Recognizing that there will be large nuclear arsenals for the foreseeable future, I am instead working to reduce their danger. There are many actions we can take, each of which would make us all safer. These actions will not be easy to take, since they will be overturning policies that have been in place for decades. But I believe that with a determined effort, we could achieve many of them. With this in mind, I formed a nonprofit organization called the William J. Perry Project to promote actions that can make our world safer from the danger of a nuclear holocaust. The primary goal is to educate the public on nuclear danger and propose specific actions we can take to reduce those dangers. The project is affiliated with the Nuclear Threat Initiative, chaired by Sam Nunn. The project is a family affair. My daughter, Robin Perry, is the overall director of the project. My son, David Perry, is the director of education. And after a few years, we decided we needed a younger voice, so we added my granddaughter, Lisa Perry, as a communication specialist. Our first project was to publish a book describing nuclear dangers, My Journey at the Nuclear Brink, which was published in 2015. After we launched this book in the United States, we had it translated in Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Arabic, and Russian. Robin and I traveled worldwide to discuss the book's messages. We also teamed up with Stanford University to create online courses, The Threat of Nuclear Terrorism and Living at the Nuclear Brink Yesterday and Today. This year, I teamed up with Tom Kalina to write another book that would be accessible to the general public, not just specialists in the field. That book, The Button, was released in June. The Japanese language version was published by Asahi Shimbun in July. Our most recent project is a documentary podcast, At the Brink, a compilation of stories told by experts in the field. Stories that bring listeners close to the real dangers that we have faced from nuclear weapons. Besides, because we were targeting a younger audience with the podcast, my daughter, Lisa Perry, who is just 32, has managed and hosted the podcast. We have released the first 4 episodes, and by the end of this summer, we have all 9 ready for you to hear. I hope we will take some time to listen at www.atthebrink.org. That sums up what I'm now doing to pursue my objective of educating the general public on nuclear dangers. It is still too early to tell whether we will be successful. If the upcoming American election brings new leadership to the United States, I will use all of these educational tools and all of my powers of persuasion to convince the next president and the next Congress that this is the time, right now, to act to make our world safer from nuclear dangers. The button concludes with a chapter that outlines the actions we could take that would make us safer. And I will conclude my talk by summarizing those actions. The American president has the sole authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. He may consult with others, but he is not required to. He has with him at all times the communication equipment, famously called the football, and the codes, often called the biscuit, to order a launch that could be then carried out a few minutes later. As I explained earlier, this is incredibly dangerous because of the possibility of his reacting to a false alarm. It is also dangerous because of the possibility that the president could be impaired for some reason, heavy drinking, heavy medications, onset of Alzheimer's disease. each of which has happened in the past. We will urge the new administration to take prompt action to require the involvement of some members of Congress in any decision to use nuclear weapons, unless nuclear weapons have already been used against us. A second recommendation is that our president should repeat Reagan's statement and Gorbachev's statement. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And state that our nuclear weapons are solely to deter a nuclear attack and that we will never use them first. A third recommendation is to reinitiate the nuclear treaties that President Trump has ended. And the new president should agree with Russia to extend New START and begin the negotiation process for a follow-on treaty. He should also begin discussions with the Russians on how to salvage the INF treaty, which had abolished medium-range missiles. And we made recommendations to modify our present nuclear forces, most importantly, including phasing out all of our ICBM, that is all of our long-range missiles, and limiting anti-missile defenses. In order for those recommendations to succeed, we will need a president who understands the dangers posed by nuclear weapons. He will need to understand that our present nuclear forces, which we consider to be a vital asset to our security, also pose great dangers to our security. If we get a president who understands all of this, we will also need to have a public who understands the danger nuclear weapons pose to them and to their families. What I'm describing could be called great expectations, but it is not mission impossible. I started my talk by telling you it is 100 seconds to midnight. And I told you why the nuclear dangers we face today warrant that judgment. And most importantly, I told you about some simple actions we could take that would greatly lower that danger. It is 100 seconds to midnight. I consider that as a personal challenge, a challenge to do everything I can to turn back the hands of the doomsday clock so that my grandchildren and your grandchildren can look forward to a full life free of the fear of a nuclear catastrophe. Thank you.
元米国防長官ウィリアム・ペリーさんの基調講演でした。
So this was Dr. William Perry,
ウィリ
former
アム・ペリーさんにはこの後
Secretary
の討
of
論にもご
Defense,
参加
and
いただきま
Dr.
す。
Perry is going to join us for the panel discussion. Now we would like to start the panel discussion. We would like to introduce distinguished panelists who are going to join Dr. William Perry. Dr. Rachel Bronson, she is CEO of Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. In consideration of the risks of nuclear weapons and the climate change, the organization sets the Doomsday clock every year. She is with us from Chicago. Professor Mitoji Yabunaka, visiting professor of Ritsumeikan University, former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. When he was Director General of Asian Oceanian Affairs Bureau, he led the Japanese delegation to the six-party talks on the nuclear issues of North Korea. After leaving the office, he states his views often on TV program. And Dr. Wakana Mukai, Assistant Professor for Faculty of International Relations, Asia University, an expert on Japanese and South Asian nuclear disarmament issues. And the panel will be facilitated by Mr. Yoshida, former Deputy Director of Editorial Board of Asahi Shimbun, and currently the Research Center for Nuclear Weapons Abolition. Fumihiko Yoshida is going to chair the session.
Thank you very much. Now we would like to start panel discussion. But thank you very much for joining us, despite the risk of the transmission coronavirus, and also today is very hot, but thank you very much for coming, and also thank you for joining those of who are joining online, and I hope this will be a very productive time for you as well. So listening to the keynote of Dr. Perry, well, Dr. Perry especially shared with us very important stories from the US viewpoint, but what about Japan? So for that, I'd like to invite Professor Yabunaka to share with his view.
Thank you for kind introduction. I am Yabunaka. We heard from the former president, the Mikhail Gorbachev, who made a good contribution to the nuclear disarmament, and also Dr. Perry, as the former Secretary of Defense, talked about the danger of the nuclear weapons. With his passion, he talked about the need to move toward nuclear abolition. Thank you for insightful messages. And it's a great honor for me to participate in this International Symposium for Peace 2020. As you heard from Mayor Taue of Nagasaki City, we would like to thank the mayor of Nagasaki and Asahi Shimbun. So I would like to talk about what I am feeling right now and thinking right now. I have to say, from the perspective of Japan concerning the current situation of nuclear weapon, I have to say that the situation is quite serious. We are in a dire situation. This is what I need to confirm with you. This is the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima Nagasaki bombing. The tragedy, which should not have happened, was here 75 years ago, and this is the 50th anniversary of the NPT treaty. When I was working in MOFA, there was a bureau about the nuclear disarmament, or we have a representative in overseas mission of Japanese government which represented Japanese efforts for the nuclear disarmament. There was strong determination to move toward the nuclear disarmament, but right now the world is moving toward the military expansion, and the ongoing military expansion include nuclear weapons. So we are returning back to the serious situation. So I have to say we face very serious dangers. I think the world is making a great mistake. Talking about NPT for non-proliferation of the nuclear weapons, the non-nuclear weapon states will not possess nuclear weapons according to the NPT. But in return, nuclear weapon states, US, Soviet or current Russia, and China, and the UK and France, they have the obligation to pursue nuclear disarmament. The reduction of nuclear weapon is obligation in NPT. It's a kind of package. However, nuclear weapon states are moving toward military expansion. Is that true? Then North Korea, if they say to North Korea not to possess nuclear weapons, I'm afraid the statement is not convincing. So it's quite important for nuclear weapon states to take up the issue of nuclear disarmament more seriously and take concrete steps. Japan is under the umbrella of nuclear weapons. And some people say that for Japan it's difficult to raise its voices, but I have to say Japan needed to speak up because Japan is a country which really experienced the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To give you more specific examples, President Trump decided to withdraw from INF treaty after suspending it. I have to say this was a serious mistake. Russia and China are doing whatever they want to say. This may be the reason cited by US, but US withdrawal from the treaty gave a free hand to those countries, allowing them to increase nuclear weapons freely. Another important issue for next year is, as Dr. Perry mentioned, is that the New START treaty expire next year. At least its extension is imperative. That means we want to demand further reduction. As you heard from Dr. Perry, the follow-on efforts to further reduce was there. But today, what we see is the possible end of the treaty itself without extension. I don't know whether it's a strategy or not, but the U.S. is saying that it's necessary to have China in the negotiation. This is what Trump is saying. But first of all, it's U.S. and Russia to decide about the extension. Then, in the further follow-on efforts for further reduction, U.S. should consider involving China. In case of lack of extension of that treaty, that would be a serious blow to the nuclear disarmament efforts. TPNW, treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, are causing serious concerns among the Japanese public because the Japanese government say that it's not going to join. Japanese government say that it will serve as a bridge between the nuclear weapon states and advocates of the TPNW, but it's not clear what Japanese government is going to do specifically. Another important message to the world from Japan is our relationship with North Korea. North Korea is continuing the nuclear missile development. We should not tolerate this movement, and Japan needs to say that clearly. Some Americans say that it has become unavoidable that North Korea will maintain a certain level of nuclear capability. They will not denounce nuclear weapons. Or other Americans might say that the current situation is bearable because there are no threats to the U.S. mainland as long as North Korea does not test ICBMs. And this is what President Trump suggested. This is the last thing that Japan wants. I think the Dr. Perry may respond to me. In his latest book, The Bulletin, one of the recommendations is rather than asking the North to surrender its nuclear arsenal, the U.S. should seek to build a fundamentally new relationship with Pyongyang. I'm afraid I don't understand what this argument implies. But my concern is that this stance can turn into acknowledging and accepting the current situation of North Korea having nuclear weapons. I need to stress we cannot accept it. Concerning the future direction, what is going to happen in November in the States? Dr. Perry talked about what the new president can do, although he did not say clearly the current president poses great danger. In a situation like this, Japan should call for nuclear weapon abolition more loudly in the international community. First of all, Japan needs to demand nuclear weapon states to pursue nuclear disarmament vis-à-vis US and vis-à-vis Russia and China. Japan needs to voice this clearly before taking various actions. As for nuclear and missile issues of North Korea, situation is quite grave. So rather than waiting for the US to handle the situation, Japan must take actions. I was one of the persons who initiated six-party talks on North Korean the issue, although negotiation did not work. But again, Japan needs to take up its initiative again to take actions so that the North Korea would be forced to abandon its nuclear programs. Another concern is that I think you've heard about the Aegis ashore, and Japan decided to give up its deployment. But in order to fill the gap of the security, citing this as a reason, discussion on the possibility for Japan to obtain the capability to attack enemy bases started. According to the latest NHK's opinion poll, 42% of the public opposes. However, 40% support it, showing that the Japanese people is divided. I was surprised. I don't know how involved these people are. I don't know whether they know the risks of this newly proposed policy. In case DPRK is allowed to go nuclear as it is, then I anticipate that the different views about nuclear capability will emerge in Japan. So it is crucial now for us renew our efforts toward nuclear disarmament, and from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we have to strengthen our appeal for nuclear abolition, and I believe important message is to come from this symposium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yamanaka. Just want to join his discussion. So the capability to strike the enemy's bases that is now being discussed in Japan, this could lead to an argument that Japan should also possess nuclear weapons. So this is quite important point. So later I would like to discuss this point. And next I will like to invite another speaker from the US. And so Dr. Bronson, hello, or good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Can you hear me okay?
聞こえますか?
大丈夫です。
Yeah, we can hear you. So I have a question for Dr. Bronson. That the doomsday clock was advanced to 100 seconds to midnight. And you are CEO of the Bulletin of the atomic scientists. Why did you choose 100 seconds to midnight? Would you please share with us the background?
Sure, thank you very much. But let me start by thanking the organizers of today's event, the city of Nagasaki, the Asahi Shimbun, and all of the other organizers. It is a great honor to be with you here today. I had planned to be with you in person, leading a leadership delegation from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. as part of a 10-day trip that would have taken us to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the upcoming peace ceremonies on August 6th and 9th. We had hoped to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Japanese people and other global dignitaries to remember together the destruction that befell these two great cities and recommit to ensuring that nuclear weapons will never again be used. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the organization that I lead, was born out of the destruction of these two cities. Founded by some of the most recognized scientists of their day, men like Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer, Hans Bethe, and others, the Bulletin's first publication circulated just 4 months after the bombs were dropped. One of the goals was to ensure that publics around the world understood that a new and wildly violent and destructive weapon had been created, that such weapons would only become more violent and more destructive if left unchecked, and that public pressure was not only important, but fundamental to ensuring that they would never again be used. How right they were then, and how right they are now. I was asked to elaborate on the remarks you've heard from former US Secretary of Defense William Perry about the setting of the Doomsday Clock and why it is now set 100 seconds to midnight. So let me start by giving you some context. The Doomsday Clock was created as the first cover of the first magazine the Bulletin published in 1947. It was set then at 7 minutes to midnight. It graced our cover in that position for 2 years until 1949, when it was moved to 3 minutes to midnight after the Soviets had tested their atomic bomb. It moved to 2 minutes to midnight in 1953 in recognition of both the United States and the Soviet Union testing hydrogen bombs. Since then, the clock has moved toward and away from midnight on 24 different occasions. It has become a guide for understanding existential threats. It has been set as far away from midnight as 17 minutes in 1991 at the end of the Cold War. And 2 minutes to midnight was the closest we had ever been to midnight until this year, when we set the Doomsday Clock at 100 seconds to midnight. And again, I've been asked to explain why. The Doomsday Clock is set by the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. You can find our members on our website at thebulletin.org. The board is made up of scientists and security experts in the fields of nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies. Every year, I ask the board to consider 2 key questions. The first, is humanity safer or at greater risk today compared to the last time that we set the clock? And the second question is humanity safer or at greater risk today compared to the more than 70 years we've been asking this question? When the clock was set in 1947, there was only one issue that threatened humanity, and that was nuclear weapons. And so nuclear risk was what the clock ultimately measured. However, towards the end of the 20th century, it became clear that a second issue, climate change, was also threatening humanity. The Bulletin had been covering climate change since the early 1960s, so the topic was not new to us. What was new was the alarming rate of change. And by 2007, the Science and Security Board could no longer answer the question of whether humanity was safer or at greater risk without explicitly mentioning climate change. And in that year, we moved the clock from 7 to 5 minutes to midnight, arguing that, quote, we stand on the brink of a second nuclear age, not since the first atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki has the world faced such perilous choices. We also made clear that, quote, the dangers posed by climate change are nearly as dire as those posed by nuclear weapons. And what differentiated the two issues was not their destructiveness, but merely the timeline in which their destructiveness could and would be felt. Secretary Perry has done a good job in laying out why in January of this year we moved the clock to 100 seconds to midnight. In our annual statement, we pointed out that national leaders had ended or undermined several major arms control treaties and negotiations, and that political conflicts regarding nuclear programs in Iran and North Korea remained unresolved and were, if anything, worsening. We once again noted, as we have year after year for the past decade, that US-Russia cooperation on arms control and disarmament was all but dormant. We began saying that shortly after the arms control agreements that Secretary Perry talked about between the US and Russia. But perhaps most importantly, we made clear that we have seen influential leaders denigrate and discard the most effective methods of addressing complex threats, international agreements with strong verification regimes, in favor of their own narrow interests and political gain. By undermining cooperative, science and law-based approaches to managing the most urgent threats to humanity, these leaders have helped to create a situation that will, if unaddressed, lead to catastrophe sooner rather than later. This is the threat before us. Together, just days before the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki's bombing, we must renew our efforts at the most grassroots level to renew global efforts to pressure our leaders here in the US, here in Japan, and around the world to avoid at all costs the new arms race that Secretary Perry discussed. That is what we owe those who perished at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and those who survived it. And that is what we owe our children and our grandchildren. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, we would like to continue our discussion on certain themes. We heard that the educating the general public about the need of the disarmament and the nuclear disarmament is quite important, but we also face pandemic. Pandemic is posing serious threat, and we are worried about the resurgence of another wave. This is the era we live in. So in the era of pandemic, and we are already suffering from pandemic in the international society, then concerning the security or the global order or security system, how will it be possible for them to change? And we want to know what would be the impact on the nuclear disarmament if we start to see the transformation of security systems. Dr. Perry, could you tell us what you think about the point I just made? Dr. Perry, could you put your microphone on?
じゃあ、あれですね、今ちょっと調子が悪いので、ブロンソンさんいかがですか?
Then can I ask Dr. Bronson to give your point first? Rachel, do you hear us? Could you give your response to the question by Mr. Yoshida?
Perry さんの音は戻りました? ブロンソンさん聞こえてます？
Rachel, do you hear us? Dr. Perry, we don't hear you from Japan.
Did you hear what I said before?
あ、
Right.
残念ながら。
Unfortunately, no, I'm sorry. We are sorry.
パンデミック
So I asked about the question about the impact of pandemic. What would be the impact of pandemic on the security, and if the security can change in a way to promote nuclear disarmament.
Did you want me to address that question?
はい。
Yes, please.
もう一度繰り返しますと、
Please allow me to repeat. We now face big issue of pandemic, and the international society
世界秩序とかあるいは
is changing because of pandemic, and I want to know the impact of that kind of change due to pandemic on the international order and the situation of disarmament and the security.
Well, the pandemic is going to cause huge economic dislocations in the United States and indeed around the world. One small silver lining around that huge dark cloud is it will force us to consider other spending, for example, our spending on nuclear weapons, and put pressure on reducing the spending on the nuclear weapons so that that funding, which is now programmed to go on nuclear weapons, can be used to deal with the economic crisis which we will be dealing with next year because of the pandemic. So the costs of the pandemic are huge. The economic impact is huge. And I believe that our public will see and our politicians will see they cannot justify spending hundreds of billions of dollars on nuclear weapons when they're faced with the economic crisis caused by the pandemic.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much.
ごめんなさい、私が間違って、本当はあれですよね、向井さんが。
Well, sorry, I should have asked Dr. Mukai to give her views. I think I repeated the mistake I made about 2 years ago. But considering the pandemic,
日本のジレンマと
and could you talk about the dilemma that faces Japan? Thank you. I am Wakada Mukai from Asia University. Every year I make sure I visit A-bombed cities to renew my pledge toward nuclear disarmament and the abolition. This year, because of the pandemic, I was afraid that I would not make it to Nagasaki, but I'm very happy that I am back in Nagasaki again, thanks to this symposium. My overall remark and the impact of pandemic is what I would like to try to do. Because of pandemic, people around the world give the top priority to pandemic. Then people may feel reluctant to talk about nuclear disarmament. Some people say that we cannot place highest priority to nuclear disarmament. But as you heard from 3 experts, we should not stop doing and taking action about this issue of nuclear disarmament. Yesterday, I visited the A-bomb museum. At the entrance, there was a message of Nagasaki City, nuclear weapon pandemic, and the global environment. All those global issues need to be tackled in the same the belief you need to own the issues. You have to respect others. You have to imagine the consequences, then take actions. I cannot agree more. These issues are different in terms of their nature, but we need to continue to think and do something about the nuclear disarmament. Can I still continue? As I listen to three experts, please allow me to say my thoughts about what Japan can and should do. As you heard from Professor Yabunaka, toward the nuclear abolition, we should not lose hope. We have to try to understand the risk of nuclear weapons in a multifaceted way. We need to appeal those dangers, and we have to initiate concrete actions. I do agree with him. Professor Yabunaka said that the nuclear weapon states should make more efforts. He stressed that the nuclear weapon states should be more proactive and active toward nuclear disarmament. I do agree with him. And in addition, we tend to focus on nuclear weapon states. But think about Japan, South Korea, or NATO countries, those countries under the nuclear umbrella. Those allies are required to take actions. Concerning TPLW, in between the supporters and those who are opposed, the division is quite serious. Because of realism of security, Japan finds it difficult to support the ban treaty. But Japan is the only A-bombed country. So ultimately, Japan has the ideal to abolish nuclear weapons. At the bottom, I understand that Japan is in support of the ban treaty. However, Japan is torn between the reality and the ideal. So what can they do when they are under the nuclear umbrella? And Professor Yabunaka talked about the role of serving as a bridge. The deterrence and the disarmament, because Japan experienced both. Japan say that it can understand both sides' ideas. However, because Japan does not possess nuclear weapons, it's impossible for Japan to make concrete and direct a contribution to nuclear disarmament, because Japan has no nuclear weapons to reduce, and people say this is a limit to Japan. But should we be complacent with this limit? Should we be allowed to stop here when we face a limitation of Japan? No, I think action needs to be taken by Japan. Japan is the only bombed country of war. Japan feels the threat of nuclear weapons. So thinking about the diplomacy for the nuclear abolition, I think it's quite in Japan for Japan to exert leadership based on the international trust. The only words are not sufficient. Concrete action needs to be taken for Japan to demonstrate impact. But what are those specific actions? Dr. Perry said in his book, one possible thing is for Japan to support the policy of non-first use of nuclear weapons. I think Mr. Yoshida will give us more concrete discussions. Japan refrained from taking another step forward. But if Japan takes that one step forward, that would change the international environment toward the nuclear disarmament and the nuclear abolition. Thank you.
Bronson.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Dr. Bronson. Can you hear us okay? So the bulletin of the atomic scientist, based on the risk of nuclear war and climate change, moves the hands of the clock. But now we have a new challenge, new threat, that is a pandemic. The pandemic is everywhere, and we are always concerned about the pandemic. And as Ms. Mukai just mentioned, maybe that our awareness about the risk of nuclear war will be diluted because of the pandemic or climate change. Maybe people tend to rather focus on something more visible. Of course, we have a nuclear risks or nuclear danger. However, many people might tend to think rather more to like a pandemic or climate change. So due to the pandemic, do you worry about the situation? It's about awareness of the people.
Thank you for that question. I think it's very clear that our lives at the moment are consumed by the pandemic, and the fact that we can't, Secretary Perry and I can't be with you today is just one of the millions and millions of examples that around the globe we're facing. The pandemic is indeed crowding out other conversations. But I think that's really important, because I think what the lesson that we should be learning is that the pandemic, along with climate change, is really, these are the 21st century threats. These are the threats that are shutting down economies, that are keeping us out. And this pandemic, we say it's once in a century, but we know they're going to come more frequently. We travel more around the globe. The science is advancing much faster. We see them come, and we know that huge amounts of money should be being put into prevention and global institutions and international responses. And so the fact that we are truly wasting money on 20th century weapons, that we are being pulled into this Cold War too, that Dr. Perry talked about, that we're in the beginnings of an arms race 2.0 between the US and the Russians. It's an absolute waste of money. We have more nuclear weapons than are needed to exterminate the planet. And there's more countries that have them and more countries that want them. And so what we can use this pandemic to demonstrate is that we need to be forward thinking about what the true challenges of the 21st century are. And we're experiencing them, and we're not, in the United States, we're not managing them well because we haven't invested in these responding. And when we did invest in them, we ripped out the funding shortly thereafter when a new administration took over. So I agree with you that the pandemic is taking away space from conversations about nuclear disarmament. But I think that's exactly the point. It should be taking away the attention of the nuclear weapons because they're the 20th century threats and 20th century weapons. And if we could get back on the path of arms control and get back on the path of reduction, we won't make these investments because we're responding to each other, and we can put our money where it belongs. So a long answer to your question, which is I think we should fully embrace what we're seeing right now, which are the true threats of today, and try to go back to a period of minimizing the weapons of the nuclear weapons, because we have so many better things to spend our money on.
Thank you very much. And Professor Yabunaka, do you have any additional comments? Right, even before the pandemic, there was something that was going on. The system over the last 75 years, that's kept the peace in the world. And also the global economy advanced in the last 75 years. This system was based on the US and free trade and also alliance. Those supported the economic growth over the last 75 years, and this system was basically centered around the US. However, now this system is about to collapse. Now the US doesn't want to be involved. The US doesn't want to send troops for defending other countries. And also, Trump said that free trade is not good for the US. And now we face pandemic, and we see more divide, especially divide in the US and China. So international cooperation. So this is a system over the last 75 years, but now this system is about to collapse. And also this pandemic occupies our minds nowadays. Therefore, other issues are being kind of left behind. And maybe during this period of time, that rather they expand nuclear weapons and they modernize nuclear weapons without their people knowing that. Or even Japan is now talking about having capability to attack the enemy's bases. So this is really a danger that we face right now. And the main topic of the symposium, and now we face the various threats. We face the various dangers and challenges. But in this symposium, we are rather focused on the nuclear weapons, how we can reduce the danger of nuclear weapons. What would be a trigger, what would be a breakthrough we can expect? So there was a discussion about the US and Russian nuclear disarmament or nuclear disarmament talk involving China. So there are various movement or activities or policy are being now discussed. However, the Russia and the US, they possessed over 90% of nuclear arsenal. Therefore, China doesn't want to join the nuclear disarmament talk. But the first step would be extend the New START. But after extending New START, how can we move on the nuclear disarmament? So we have to think about the future after extending New START. So Dr. Perry, in order to promote the nuclear disarmament between US and Russia, do you have any additional comments on this topic, Dr. Perry?
Thank you. Yes, I believe, as I said, that we should, without discussion or debate, simply extend the New START Treaty and then begin a negotiation with Russia on a follow-on treaty with much deeper reductions. And in those, and this negotiation of that treaty, I believe we should invite China as an observer, because when we eventually get our numbers down to approach those of China, they can become a participant. But between now and then, I think it would be good for them and good for us if they became an observer in the negotiations for the follow-on of the New START Treaty.
Thank you very much. And Professor Mukai, do you have any additional idea? So far, the nuclear disarmament has been discussed and carried out between just US and Russia. And then other countries are following what they do. That is what we have observed so far. But probably we are now phasing out from that kind of stage, and China and also other countries. there are other countries who possess the nuclear weapons. Therefore, we need to involve all the nuclear weapon states. So in order to do so, there must be another framework. And NPT regime, that is very important. But we don't need to stick to an NPT regime because we tend to think about NPT and other treaties. So in order to involve Pakistan, India, and Israel, and North Korea. So in order to involve these nuclear states, we must set another framework.
Professor Yabunaga, yes, I agree with them. First of all, talk is necessary between US and Russia for the extension of a New START, and then invite China as an observer. By making sure that China will not say no to this arrangement, then we can gain transparency, especially about the Chinese activity of a nuclear weapon. There has been no way to know what they are doing. But by having China as an observer, the transparency will be obtained. But my concern is that the current US-China conflict, I don't know whether they can build a relationship based on trust. And first of all, US need to get closer to Russia so that China cannot say no to that offer to join. Rachel, Dr. Bronson, the US is going to have a presidential election this year. As for the issue of nuclear disarmament, I'm afraid that the nuclear disarmament is not an important issue for the presidential debate from the perspective of Japan. For an ordinary the citizen of the US, they are overwhelmed with more immediate issues. So the situation may not be new, but the Trump's policy is causing a lot of concern, and the priority given to the nuclear disarmament in the presidential election debate remains low, and it's a big concern for me. Could you respond to assess the situation?
One of the things that was quite interesting about the Democratic primary that was cut short because of the virus was the fact that the issue of nuclear weapons was actually being discussed to a greater extent than I had expected or had seen in the past. I had been out in Iowa just as they went into their primary votes. Elections in the United States are very rarely about foreign policy. It's very much domestic policy first. So your question has a lot of merit, but being out at some of the key campaign areas during the primaries, it was interesting to see that nuclear weapons were higher on the agenda for the public than had been in the past. And part of that is because nuclear issues have very much been in the news. Of course, Iran is in the news in the United States, but North Korea is as well. And I don't have to remind this audience how tense things were in 2017 and 2018 between the United States and North Korea. They remain so, but they were really front page news. So my sense is that people are actually quite interested. They just don't know what to do about it. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the issue come back up in the presidential debates now between Vice President Biden and President Trump, because I do think that is going to try to be rolling out a much more sensible foreign policy and domestic agenda and health agenda. I think all of but I think Biden is going to have an easier time setting himself up as different than President Trump, especially because of the New START, that if he wins, he will have to move very quickly towards renewing it. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he does make it an issue. It's not going to be central. It's not going to be a driving force. Foreign policy will always take second to domestic policy. But I think we should expect to see more on nuclear weapons. I think there's the amounts that we're spending, the treaties we're walking away from. Issues of nuclear weapons will actually distinguish the two candidates. And I suspect candidate Biden is going to want to make that separation very apparent. So we'll have to wait and see. But I think it will be a bit more in the discussion than maybe in past presidential elections, of the recent past.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you. Dr. Perry, I have a question.
最初のキーノートスピーチの中で
In your keynote speech,
ICBM
you said that the ICBM, land-based ICBMs,
だんだん減らしていって
need to be phased out
すべきである。
to bring it down to zero.
これは朝日新聞のインタビューの中で
And in your interview with Asahi
ソ連
Shimbun,
が応じなくするロシアが応じなく
you
する
said, in case Russia does not respond,
その方がむしろアメリ
it's better for US to take unilateral action to phase out ICBM.
することがなかなか難しいものは
When treaty is difficult to get,
によって
then government should try something other than treaty in order to make advances in nuclear disarmament. This is what you said. Could you elaborate on these points?
Well, I'm very much in favor of treaties, of extending New START immediately, as Dr. Bronson has said, and beginning the immediate negotiations for a follow-on treaty, and for reinstating the INF treaty. All of those things should be done very early, and I would believe very likely that President Biden would, if he's elected, will do that. In terms of the non-treaty actions, without waiting to see what Russia would do on ICBMs, on the long-range missiles, the United States can make a unilateral decision that it can achieve its deterrence with submarines and bomber forces only, and therefore phase out the ICBMs. And the reason for doing that is because the ICBMs are so dangerous. They're the principal reason we have a likely possibility of having an accidental nuclear war, because of they're located at known positions on the ground, very vulnerable to attack, and therefore we have this quick launch policy. It's the quick launch policy which makes them so dangerous. So if we can achieve our deterrence without taking that risk, we ought to do that, and that's basically what the recommendation is.
Another question to Dr. Perry. The phase out of ICBM and the declaration of no first use, I believe that will be a great step toward nuclear disarmament. Do you think that way?
Yes, I agree. And I would note that in the Democratic platform, there is a statement that they should go for what's called sole purpose, that is proclaiming that ICBMs will be used only for the purpose of deterrence. And that basically isn't for no first use policy, because so that would go a long way towards achieving the objective of no first use policy. So the one good thing, while there may or may not be discussions of this during the debate, the one good thing about the Democratic platform is it does call for a declaration of a sole purpose of nuclear weapons. And I think that's a very positive thing.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Professor
アメ
Yabunaka,
リカの核戦争不使用なしは唯一
the non-first use declaration by US
の安全
for the sole purpose
常に同盟国間の
and
対
the
象になる
allies are discussing this issue because that might impact the security. Should Japan accept those policies?
これは時代の変化ということ
And due to changing times and also the graveness of the nuclear weapons and also grave danger that posed by the nuclear weapons and how to move ahead with the nuclear disarmament. So based on those discussions, Japan must be involved in a discussion with the US. And also Australia and other allies of the US should be also involved in such a discussion. So first engagement in discussion, and then
これがまさに
the non-first use.
粛を進めて
And that
この地域
could
は確かなものにする
lead to the nuclear disarmament, providing safer space in this region. And if we can agree with that, but of course we must defend ourselves, therefore that we must commit to each other.
そういうのがあれば
And if that is possible, of course this is the one path forward for Japan. Thank you very
ノー
much.
ファーストユースは
So regarding non-first use, the China
その信頼性
unilaterally declared the non-first use for many years, and people actually doubt about that. But if the U.S. and U.S. allies
アジアの安全保障
agreed on non-first use of nuclear weapons of the United States, that will have a positive impact on Asia, including China, I believe. So once we can pile up such kind of discussion, and that non-first use could be quite supportive for future nuclear arms production. Yes, it's very important to involve China in such a discussion, of course.
米中の間で
At the same time,
そういう
that
話ができるのかいな
whether the Japan can engage discussion with China now, or U.S. can engage discussion with China because of such an tension between the two countries. So what can Japan do? So, of course, involving China, Russia, U.S.,
そういう必要性そういう
that
チャンス
Japan,
必要性が目
of course, should initiate such discussion involving U.S., Russia, and China. And what about Mukai, Professor Mukai? Yes, as the Professor Yabunaka said, that Japan should show a big picture for the future. And regarding a non-first use, so what is related is a negative security. Excuse me, could you please explain the negative? The security is basically the nuclear space, the nuclear state do not attack by using the nuclear weapon to the non-nuclear state, or they do not threat with the use of the nuclear weapon to non-nuclear state countries. So negative security assurance. So this is not related to the treaty, but those nuclear weapon states, together with the non-first use, come up with a new framework. That will be very important. So it's about security. So you assure security for non-nuclear states. So this is very important space as important thing that the nuclear state should be doing. But of course, as we discussed, there is a distrust among nuclear weapon states. Therefore, first we must improve the relation between the nuclear armed state.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much.
そろそろ次の
And moving on to the next topic.
今、米中ロの
So we discussed about the U.S., Russia, and China. Those are nuclear superpowers. We will focus on those nuclear superpowers. But the next topic will be about North Korea.
非核化というのはですね、
denuclearization of North Korea, and there was a hope in that 2018 or so, but unfortunately, over close to 2 years, that negotiation with North Korea has been stagnant. How can we change? How can we accelerate negotiation with North Korea? This is next topic. And Mr. Yamanaka, as being already introduced, he is the founding father of six-party talk with North Korea, and also Dr. Perry. Dr. Perry proposed the Perry process in 1990s involving negotiation with North Korea. So I have a question for Dr. Perry. North Korea, that the North Korean nuclear issue. So in order to denuclearize Korean Peninsula, what could be a breakthrough? What can actually the policy that can change North Korea to give up the nuclear weapons?
I'm afraid my answer to that is very unlikely that they will. I spent, as you know, several years of my life working on that problem, including trips to Pyongyang where I spoke with the leaders of the North Korean government, trying to persuade them not to build a nuclear arsenal. We had an agreement, a verbal agreement, by which they would not do that. But one thing I learned at that meeting, those meetings, was that the reason the North Koreans wanted to build a nuclear arsenal was they believed, with some justice, that the United States would use military force to overthrow the regime. And they saw the nuclear weapon as a way of deterring the United States from using that military force. That was their reason, and I came to believe that that's what they really thought. So my negotiations with them were not really focused on economic issues at all, or economic incentives, mostly focused on what could we say or do to them that would give them some confidence that we were not going to launch a military attack against them. We dealt with such issues as establishing agreeing to end the Korean War formally. Such issues as the United States opening up an embassy in Pyongyang. The United States forming economic relationships with North Korea. All of these soft power things were what really interested them. And I thought at the time that we were going to get the agreement. But just months before the agreement was to be signed, the administration changed. A new administration came in. They had a different idea about how to deal with the North Korean problem, that they would pressure them to give them up. That might have been a good idea, but unfortunately it was quite clear it did not work, because a few years after they were pursuing that policy, North Korea ended up with a nuclear arsenal and has an even larger one today. My problem of negotiating one was difficult enough, but all I had to do to get to agree not to build a nuclear arsenal. Anybody that's negotiating today has to get to agree to give up a nuclear arsenal that they already have, and they like it very much. I do not. So I think, first of all, the present administration does not understand what's driving North Korea, and therefore they're unlikely to succeed in negotiations. If they did understand that, they might not be willing to make the offers, which would make the difference. So I think it's very unlikely we're going to get North Korea to give up its nuclear arsenal. And we should work very hard, and given that, we should work very hard to be sure that's never used. The one bit of good news I have from all this, in my discussions with the North Koreans, I became convinced of the same conclusion about the North Koreans I have about the Russians, which they're not suicidal. They will not use the nuclear arsenal in an unprovoked way. So I don't think we have to worry too much about that nuclear arsenal. I would much rather they didn't have it, and I'm sorry that the negotiations I was involved with were terminated before they could finish. But I do not believe there's a danger of North Korea making an unprovoked attack on South Korea, Japan, or the United States, or any other country. So I would not discourage negotiations with North Korea to get to give up nuclear weapons. I just would not offer much hope for it. The so-called Perry process, which you described, was in a different era with a different set, had the same objective, but had a different set of constraints. We could have succeeded then, and I do not believe it's likely we will succeed today.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much.
はい、
Professor
今
Yamanaka.
言われたように非常に難しい状況にある
As
ことは
Dr. Perry
その通り
mentioned,
だと思い
the
ます。
situation
た
is
だ
so
だからといって
difficult to
ある
deal
程
with.
度の核の能力というのを認めた上で新しい関係を北朝鮮と築
building
くと
new relationship after allying for a certain level of nuclear capability to North Korea, I need to say this is wrong. We still have hopes
2019年の
and opportunities. In February of 2019 in Hanoi, there was a summit meeting which failed. However, North Korea said that the Yongbyon is for the plutonium and also for the highly enriched uranium. The North Korea put it on the negotiating table, talking about possibility to close Yongbyon. But it's true that the North Korea have other facilities. But the North Korea was ready to put it on the table, but there was nothing that the North Korea could return. And at the end, the summit meeting did not produce any outcome. That means back then North Korea was ready to negotiate. But today, North Korea suffered seriously because of economic impact. In 2018, in the first meeting in June between the Kim and Trump, Trump said that there should be no ICBM testing. Without ICBM testing, there will be no the threat to the U.S. mainland. Then there will be no decapitating attack. That stays, but we need something more. Then what are the specific arrangement in the treatment? There has been nothing. And in the summit meeting, the President Trump said this and that. And he said that as long as Kim does not launch ICBM, the U.S. is happy. But Japan needs to say we need something more. We need to try to engage China. Together with China, working with China is a must when we face North Korea. This is what you should do, and this is what we are going to propose to you. You need the concrete arrangement. You need to have the working level meetings by the vice ministers or ministers before the summit between North Korea and the U.S. president. And there are some hopes and opportunity for us to Japan to do something about it.
先ほどから議論が話に出てますように、日本のミサイル
In relation to that, Japanese missile defense capability, now that the Aegis Ashore has been cancelled, now we see the mounting discussion on the capability to attack enemy bases. I think it assumes North Korea. Dr. Perry may not be till the end of the symposium, so this is the question I have to Dr. Perry. Looking at Japan faced with the North Korea, we don't see any effective way out. Then there is a discussion demanding the military expansion for Japan. I think personally this is bad for the Japan nor to US and the Japan-US relationship alliance. But what do you evaluate? How do you evaluate the mounting discussion about the expansion military capability of Japan?
I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer all that's implied by your question. I will say, however, that even if we were to negotiate North Korea giving up their ICBM program, They already have missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons to both South Korea and Japan. So that doesn't really accomplish the objective we're seeking for. I think we have to understand that North Korea had those weapons, that they're capable of attacking South Korea and Japan at least, and that our policies ought to be oriented around making sure they never see that that's a reasonable thing for them to do. And so on the one hand, we have deterrence, and we keep that deterrence. They understand that that deterrence would apply to any attacks against either South Korea or Japan. But secondly, we should work in a positive way to try to develop normal relationships with North Korea. The key to that is neither the United States or Japan. The key to that is South Korea. And the present government in South Korea is working hard to try to achieve that goal. Unfortunately, the United States administration does not see that in their interest and have been trying to block him from doing that. Hopefully with the new administration, we'll take the proper approach and encourage South Korea to negotiate economic relationship and social relationships with the North Korea. And that would be a positive step toward easing the tensions on the Korean Peninsula, which would thereby reduce the chance of a military conflict, which could escalate into a nuclear conflict. I believe that the probability of a conflict with North Korea would result not from the North Korean deciding to start a war. It would result, just like my concern with the US and Russia relationship, it could happen by a political miscalculation or an accident. So we should try to develop, in particular South Korea, develop positive working relationship and economic relationship with the North to reduce the chance of a political miscalculation leading to a war.
Thank you very much. Professor Yamanaka. Well, from Japanese perspective and from US perspective, I see the difference in consistency. I agree that between South Korea and North Korea, there should be a better economic relationship and there should be engagement of Japan and China to create an environment nudging North Korea toward the surrendering nuclear weapons. This is what Americans say, but for Japan, it's not acceptable. Approach itself is not acceptable at all. Building the trust-based relationship to make it realize Japan knows that Japan would have to make huge compromises. We depend on deterrence of the US, and deterrence is make sure that the other party will not use the weapons. But we need efforts to ensure that what North Korea has need to be reduced. We have to go into the process of actual reduction. Otherwise, we cannot build long-time peace. And when North Korea has the nuclear capability, then if U.S. try to build a new relationship with North Korea, then I anticipate that Japan and South Korea will be talking about acquiring nuclear capability. Japan is a country with strongest commitment to non-nuclear principle. Japan has the quite advanced technology, while it is committed to the non-nuclear policy. To ensure this policy concerning the nuclear weapons of North Korea, we have to make movement toward the reducing and making nuclear weapons zero. We do need commitment by U.S. in this process. Dr. Bronson, talking about the North Korean nuclear issues, what about in the minds of the U.S. public? when North Korea is not launching ICBM, then I wonder whether the American people are not interested so much in the North Korean nuclear weapons. I wonder whether there is any difference between Japan and the American public.
I think what we saw in 2017 was that North Korea's nuclear weapons program is very much on Americans' minds. Now, to be sure, there's questions about whether they can hit the American mainland, when would they be able to hit the American mainland. But I think there's very little trust in the North Koreans and a considerable concern over their nuclear program. And so there's not a lot of confidence in the North Koreans. So I think that your question of how Americans think about North Korea, and is there a difference when they think about Japan and South Korea versus the US? Yes, I think there is a difference in the minds of Americans, as there would be any difference with any other country. But I think you can look at polling and everything there's a real concern about North Korea. There's not a trust about North Korea. And in that, there's an understanding why the Japanese and the South Koreans among the American people would be so concerned about it. And so I don't think the American people are agnostic about the North Koreans. And I think it pushed on it a real understanding about why the Japanese and the South Koreans would be as concerned about the North Koreans as they are. I don't think that takes away from anything certainly that's been said. It's only to say that North Korea is very much in the news here at a very basic level. And so what's happening in Asia, particularly around North Korea, does get the attention of the American people.
Thank you very much. And Professor Mukai, do you have anything to add? In a short period of time, there is an effect. North Korea already possessed the nuclear weapons. Therefore, how to persuade them not to use nuclear weapons? So this will be our short-term focus. But of course, Japan doesn't allow the situation where North Korea continue to possess nuclear weapons. Therefore, long-term, we have to look at possibility how we can persuade, reduce their nuclear arsenals, and bring it to zero in even a longer term. Therefore, we must keep that final goal in engagement with North Korea. Thank you very much. And we are running out of time, but let me move on to another topic, and this is related to North Korea. So this symposium is focused on the nuclear issues, including the nuclear superpowers and also the situation surrounding Japan. But in the nuclear disarmament, what can Japan do? And we have discussed at some point already, but once again, why don't we just discuss what Japan can do in reducing a nuclear arsenal? So Dr. Perry, what Japan can do to reduce nuclear arms? Dr. Perry, did you hear that? What can Japan?
Yes. Japan can do several things. One of them is set an example, which they've done through the years, of being opposed to nuclear weapons altogether. Second, very specific, is stop being opposed to a no first use policy. When I was in the Clinton administration as Secretary of Defense, we were very close to getting a no first use policy. And in the final deliberations of it, the balance was tipped against it by a Japanese delegation coming and arguing against it. I think that was unhelpful both for the United States policy and for the Japanese people. So if this question comes up again in the Biden administration, I urge the Japanese government to not oppose the no first use policy. I think it's in their best interest, indeed the planet's best interest, to be such a policy. So those are two specific things to think about.
ありがとうございます。もう
And thank you very much, Dr. Perry. One more thing. What do you expect an A-bound country, that is Japan, what do you expect from Japan? So what, Dr. Perry, what do you expect from Japan, only nation that was, received A bombings?
Japan has been a strong and steady ally through the decades, and I would like them to continue that. I'd like them to continue also their serving as a conscience for the world against the use of nuclear weapons. And as I said, one way of doing that, explicit way of doing that, would be come out in support of a no first use policy, in support of some of the particular steps which I described in my talk, which can be lower the dangers of nuclear warfare, of which an important one is the no first use policy. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much.
それではですね、もう一人アメリカからの見方という
And
ブロンソンさんの
so once again, Dr. Bronson,
役割各国
what do you see Japan? What do you expect Japan doing in reducing nuclear threat?
Well, I'd really like to echo what Secretary Perry said. I think those were a good place to leave it on. And I do want to say how honored I am to be part of this session and how important it is on the 75th anniversary that we renew our commitment to continue to work together to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons in a face of new investments and considerable advancements in technology. We're going to be able to move forward is if we keep pushing international agreements and institutions and ways to ensure that we don't have an excuse to keep building, because the momentum is there to keep building. And so we need the continued efforts of conferences like this, of the Japanese continuing to put this on the table, to advocating for for them never to be used again, and to follow policies like Secretary Perry outlined that can be helpful to ensuring that they're never used again.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Yabunaka. Yes. So what should Japan do? That is something I have been thinking. So in this region, this is an initiative to create a peace in this region. That is very important. And of course, nuclear issue is one of the major issues in creating a peace in this region. And their point about the nuclear issues. One is that Japan show its strong commitment for non-nuclear policy. As I said, from different countries, they see that Japan has money and technology to develop nuclear weapon itself. But Japan should once again show its clear commitment to non-nuclear policy. And we must clarify that once again. And also the trust. It's very important that the nuclear weapons will never be used. But in order to do so, we must build trust and confidence in this region through diplomatic means. And that must be based on the trust relation between the US and Japan. But at the same time, Japan must create confidence with China and also between North Korea and South Korea. So there are a lot of things that Japan should do. Therefore, in this region, Japan must show its willingness to create peace in this region. So we have to continue such an effort. This is not just a word, but it's very difficult to create confidence among neighboring countries, but we must continue our efforts.
Thank you very much, Professor Mukai. Japan is under the nuclear umbrella, and Japan is the only country with the nuclear bomb dropped in a war. How can we overcome this Japanese dilemma? If you have anything to say about this dilemma, please. Japan is the only A-bombed country in a war. So that set Japan apart. It's quite important to appeal to the world that Japan, this is what Japan experienced. And again and again, we need to repeat this message vis-a-vis my university student. I feel the need to keep on talking about the experience of Japan. As for the concrete policies, the policy of non-first use, are there any way for Japan to show its support to non-first use? I know that might have some impact on the US-Japan relationship, but in a way, not to undermine the Japan-US the security relations. There must be a way for Japan to show its support to non-first use. And in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, people maintain high interest. But in Tokyo, people tend to feel that these are remote issues. However, these are important threats to whole humanity. So it's quite important to educate the public so that they start to understand that this is a shared common threat. Secretary Perry needed to leave the symposium, but he talked about the Perry project, and he remains quite passionate about the nuclear disarmament. And the three panelists on the stage are also teaching in a university. And according to the publication of the Bulletin, the year Bulletin radio shares with us a lot of educational materials. So, as Professor Mukai mentioned, it's quite important to attract more attention from the general public. It's quite important to educate younger next generations and make them interested. Dr. Bronson, for you, Britain, concerning public education, what are you doing? What are your plans for the public education?
We've been seeing at the Bulletin, and I think this is quite important, is that we've been seeing our audiences growing at incredible rates over the last few years. And so, and 50% of our audience is below age 35, which is often surprising to people. But in the last 12 months, we've had about 500,000 people on our site, and half of them are younger. So I don't think it's that young people don't care. I think young people today are assaulted with existential threats in a way that my generation really wasn't. Nuclear threat really is front page news for them regularly. I have kids of my own, they ask questions because between Iran and North Korea, it's a scare, and then the Russian. So it's in addition to nuclear weapons, they're facing issues of climate change, there's pandemic now. In the US, there's shootings that they don't know about it. I think it's that they don't know what to do about it. And this is where I think our organization can be helpful. They can learn a lot more. We speak in high schools and even middle schools about the issues. We think a lot about how we present the materials, offering more opportunities, getting on new channels, making sure that they can find our information on the platforms that they get their news from. And so we're playing catch up on that, but we're spending a lot of time thinking about how to make it to do about it. That's where the ban the bomb movement is important. It captures people to be able to have conversations. It's the Doomsday way for young people.
Thank you. Thank you. Several years ago, Rachel, do you hear me? I'm saying that a couple of years ago, you put your bulletin online. And was it effective in increasing audience by changing your bulletin on an online format? Rachel?
In 2000, and it was really early. It did necessarily make it easier. But now that we've been online for 11 years, and that has been useful to our making sure that you're thinking about Instagram and TikTok and thinking about, how do we get onto Apple News and where are kids getting their message and how are they seeing it, trying to make sure we have, art and multimedia and podcasts that Dr. Perry was talking about. We just have to make sure that we're staying up with the kids and making sure that they, when they want the information, that we get it to them in an accessible way. In general, we tend to be more about college level and graduate level kids, but to the extent to which we can help others get into younger demographics, we do virtual field trips with the Manhattan Project. We had a museum exhibit that's now online. Anything that we can do that's more interactive, we explore it and we try to get out in front of it. But I don't think it's a lack of interest. I think it's just a lack of what can kids do, and making sure that they see that, as we heard from Barack Obama yesterday and others, voting matters and asking the candidates about these issues and keeping the pressure on is really a very
Thank you. As mayor of Nagasaki suggested, because of pandemic, we are forced to have a conference meeting gathering like this, and we now start to see new horizon as a faculty in the educational field. In order to get good of what we are facing, I believe that the online education will also improve. And how can we take advantage of the improvement of online education for the nuclear disarmament? Mr. Mukai? I have a course on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation in my university. first day, students have virtually no knowledge about these issues. So I wonder whether I can come to the end of the 10 classes. We finished one course, and one student said that it's been rare for them to think about one issue so deep. I now understand the issue of nuclear weapon is so complex, but it's a kind of obligation for Japanese to think about nuclear weapons, and most of the students said that they wanted to learn more about nuclear weapons. There are abundant information available online, and the young people no longer go to library to read books. They are ready to get access from the smartphone. They know how to get information. So as long as we make sure that they receive correct, accurate information, younger people can increase their knowledge and build foundation for a good judgment. As Mayor mentioned, this may be one opportunity.
And what about Professor Yamanaka? Yes, now we are online based. I'm now familiar with providing education online, but now we find a way to provide online education. Of course, it requires a lot of preparation in our side, but young people should know about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also the devastation of war and history in general. Young people tend to avoid discussing about history, but I now teach at university, and also I run a Terakoya private school in order to tell those issues to young people. And as we discussed online education, another point that is negative is about SNS. We're now living in the age of SNS. In SNS, people tend to use shorter sentences to provoke something, and many messages could be very provocative. Therefore, we make sure that young people understand the way to access the SNS information. And so that is another perspective that we make sure that young people are well prepared when they access the information that is available in SNS. And I hope my student will be joining one of those symposiums in the future. Thank you very much. So we are now in overtime, but then before we close, I would like to ask each speaker, maybe 30 seconds or so, to share with us your last message. So, Dr. Bronson, would you please share with us your last message?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about what the pandemic is teaching us, and how we can apply it to the nuclear realm, or if there's an application. And maybe I can leave with three learnings, I think, from this pandemic that are important to what we're talking about. First, that international agreements and institutions are important. We've seen, certainly in the United States, an attack on the World Health Organization and a determination to call it the Chinese virus, and that what we know is that these are global problems, and global problems require global solutions. And so just like in the nuclear realm, the WHO is not perfect. It needs improvement. People inside it would say that, but we need to build on what we have. And if we're going to replace it with something better, and not destroy it and hope something else comes in its place. And I think the same can be said for arms control. I think we're in the same position where we can point to all the faults of the Iran deal or New START and all those faults. Many would agree that they're there, but it's still keeping us a whole lot safer. They were all keeping us a whole lot safer. And so we need to build on what we have, and international solutions require international international problems require international solutions. The second thing is that the role of scientists and expertise really matters. There's a reason why we're all getting briefed by recognized doctors and epidemiologists and virologists. At this time when your life is on the line, you want medical experts and scientists to be advising. And the same is true on nuclear issues. And know the ins and outs, Dr. Perry and others, of the different weapon system. You want the experts, the scientists and the experts to weighing in, their voices heard. And there's been a global movement towards the denigration of expertise and science. And I think both on the pandemic and nuclear, we are deadly important. You want the experts to help you on this. And then finally, I would say the third, that individual action home, wearing our masks and social distancing, that's going a long way to keeping us all safe. And in the nuclear realm, I think that individual action of continuing to act, to pressure our leaders, to make sure that we ask questions about it, to stay informed, that individual action at the end of the day is really all we have and what matters the most. And so I think there's things that we continue to learn. It feels like we should know this anyway, but international problems require international solutions. The role of science and expertise continues to matter and probably matters more now than ever, and that individual action is needed, both in responding to the pandemic and in terms of managing nuclear risk.
Thank you very much. And so next, Professor Yamanaka. Well, I thought that the last one was my last opportunity to speak, but once again, so we face the threat, and the doomsday clock is now advancing. As Dr. Bronson said, in Japan, August is a very special month. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we look back what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or Japan as a whole, in the wartime. But at the same time, we always be reminded the danger of the current nuclear threat. We must be reminded this every day, and we have to think how we can improve the situation, and also especially young people, younger generations. Today, I have a great hope on this symposium. In this afternoon, the young people will speak out at this symposium. They are going to share with us what they are doing in Nagasaki and other locations. I'm looking forward to the afternoon session. Thank you very much. So this issue is not something that is away or that is remote. This is related to each individual, and each individual has a different role to play. So once again, we must be reminded that everyone is part of this, and everyone must play a role in this. And I believe not only young people, regardless of generations, regardless of gender, this is an issue for everybody. We shouldn't really rely on young people or let young people to deal with it, but this is related to all generations. Thank you very much. On the other day, I spoke with Ms. Nakamuchi, the Secretary of the United States, and I asked her, what is your message? And she said, the nuclear disarmament. Then she said that she wants to show determination toward nuclear disarmament. So once you come to Hiroshima or Nagasaki, A-bomb cities, you will be reminded the importance of having the determination to work on the nuclear disarmament, so that nuclear bomb cities they play a very important role. So this is something that we all must be reminded of. So due to the COVID-19, this time we had this online discussion, but this was also a great new challenge. So now I'd like to close the morning session. And also I'd like to thank you, simultaneous interpreters. Thank you very much.
それではこれで終わりとしておきます。
Okay, that concludes our morning session. Thank you very much, Dr. Bronson, as well, for joining from the US. Thank you so much.
どうもありがとうございました。それではパネリストの皆様にはご退場いただきます。
Thank you very much. Now, all speakers will step down from the stage. Thank you very much.
これよりお昼の休憩を挟み、午後1時半より第2部を開催いたします。なお、同時通訳は一部のみで行いますので、会場をお出になる場合は、レシーバーを受付にお返しください。